Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Rent Prep for Landlords. I'm your host, Eric Worrell, and this is episode number 302. We have a guest on today's episode. We're going to be talking about rent control out in California. Our guest is Andres Segovia, who is not only a property manager, but also an investor and a broker out in California. And he's in the LA area. And he's giving his insights on what he's seen since rent control has been introduced statewide in California as of January 1st, 2020. The fallout, so to speak, the pros and cons of what's going on out there. I thought it'd be interesting to have him on the podcast. He actually is a client of Rent Prep, and he reached out. And I said, hey, why don't you come on the podcast? Tell us what you see going on out there. Give us some of your insights. And you'll see that I kind of just let Andres just kind of run the show on this episode. I did a great job of breaking down some of the laws, some of the things that I wasn't familiar with rent control in California, but also why, if you're in another state, that you may be interested in what's going on out there, as that may trickle down to your state or even on a federal level. So we're going to get to that right after this.
1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah.
Welcome to the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast. And now your host, Eric Worrell.
The problem is that rent control isn't anything new here. Los Angeles had it in 1978. San Francisco's had it. And the two worst places of homelessness cases, where it's an epidemic, quite literally, and where we have the highest rental prices in the country, are Los Angeles and San Francisco.
Mm-hmm. Now, do you think that that's like, what's the phrase? Is that cause or correlation, you think? Because obviously maybe that was implemented in those areas because there was a problem already? Or do you think that it's because that was implemented, there's a problem now?
It was implemented then because there was a problem. Now, this was before my time, so I didn't live to see that play out, and how some would say there was price gouging in rentals. The thing is that rent control itself was meant to cap rental rates. That's the intention. And also to reduce homelessness, because people were being pressed out of their units. Mm-hmm. So why is it that this is the worst place for rental rates and for the worst cases of homelessness? Mm-hmm. So if the program didn't work, rent control is not the solution. The thing is that the statewide rent cap that went into effect January 1st that made national headline news, we're the second state to have statewide rent cap. The first one was Oregon. Mm-hmm. The thing is, we knew it was coming because in 2018, we were battling at the ballot Proposition 10. Proposition 10 would have instituted a statewide rent cap in the first place. It was perpetuated by a lot of people taking to the streets and the legislative or city councils and complaining about the rent being too damn high, they would say. So that became like the rallying cry for tenant activists that were joined by the unions to really push this through. It lost support towards the end because those that supported it didn't read what it was meant to do. It was literally going to be rent control across every property, including single-family homes, condominiums that are homeowner and primary residents. For those that are not familiar with rent control is, it's a rent cap. And you can only increase rent on a schedule that, in this case, like the city, for example, because they're the ones that really control and set these things up. They issue a calendar or a schedule that how much of a rent you can increase. At 2 or 3%, it tends to be the average norm.
And but for the state of California, what is it, 5%?
It's capped at...
I think I read it's capped at a total of 10, right? But it's
5% cap plus the consumer price index. So whatever inflation is, and the numbers being thrown out 3%. So this year people can raise it up to 8% max.
Yeah.
The state law is basically like just the basis. LA is super strict. So to give an example of what rent control truly is, that's why I turned to LA, because that's the sample, the strongest example that anybody can have. It's not just a cap. It's also that multiple bureaucratic departments get involved in your property. You have the Department of Building and Safety. That's usually called upon by the housing department. The housing department is the one that basically is overseeing your property, because they want to make sure that you are maintaining your unit to health and safety standards that have people living in them. So they do an annual inspection to the property.
Yeah.
They tend to send notices, but there are surprise inspections too. So the landlord pays for those inspections, and the landlord has to register every single year that unit is a rental unit. So it's kind of like a business registration to that extent. And on top of that, there's a business tax associated with that. So those are three things that are associated with in this whole rent stabilization ordinance or rent control. That's the thing, that we don't know who the inspectors tend to be. And and most of these are not building inspectors. So they go and they have an opinion, for example, of a doorknob. It says, this doorknob's illegal. I need you to change it. You have a citation. Here's a fee. Get it fixed and get the Department of Building and Safety to sign off on this. Then the Department of Building and Safety would go out there and say, this doorknob is fine. You can't replace for the other one because that other doorknob is illegal. So we take that notice, go to the housing department, and the housing department said, no, we told you what we want.
Is this a true story or is this an example?
I'm giving you an example of what we had to deal with. This was last year.
Yeah.
So this was last year.
It sounds so ridiculous. I'm wondering if you were just, coming up with a story on the top of your head, or that's something you actually had to deal with.
No, but I do have the this one I dealt with, but I also have the address, not my property, that I actually dealt with with my father, who's a contractor of our construction business, that we dealt together in East Los Angeles. I remember the address off the top of my head. I'm not going to rattle it off, but it was a case that lasted about 18 months. It was a bank-owned property. It was about 4 units. There was a lot of issues there because of the tenants had their own attorneys. And there is something called a REAP program. This thing sounds weird. It says Rental Escrow Account Program. Basically, it's the tenants going on strike. I'm not paying you the rent. So this REAP program defends the tenants from having to pay the rent. So during those 18 months, these tenants didn't pay one dime to the bank because they supposedly were paying the bank. And in the meanwhile, we had housing and building and safety at each other's throats. Both of this is the city of Los Angeles, the Department of Building and Safety of Los Angeles, and the Los Angeles Housing Department. That's not even to say the community department, which is sometimes involved too. So like the flip, what is all this? Pure bureaucracy. It lasted 18 months because none of these morons would talk to each other. And we were tasked to be brought in to try to alleviate this issue. So we did get it resolved. It took 18 months, but it did get resolved. And the thing is, you had REAP defending the tenants against the greedy landlord, in this case being the bank, and hating on us, the construction company and the property managers, because we were in league with the greedy 1% they saw. And your building and safety, who these guys just didn't care, like one way or another, because they were fining and giving citations every single time. Mm-hmm. If something is not resolved in a timely manner, the Department of Building and Safety can escalate the case to code enforcement, which is above that in the Department of Building and Safety. If code enforcement, if you don't comply with them by a certain case or a certain time frame, they can do what is called a substandard. It's a condemnation of the property. You can't do anything with it, and it's just short of eminent domain. The ones that can do eminent domain is the housing department, because if you fail to comply, that means you, the landlord, were not being responsible for the property and you were not taking care of the tenants. So therefore, you lost all rights to the property. You get no rent and housing takes over, aka the government takes over your property. That is Los Angeles in a nutshell. So the Proposition 10 that the voters voted down, and it went down in flames, actually, which is hallelujah. There's still some sanity in California. We shot it down in 2018. The tenant activists and the unions that were supporting it didn't realize that they were going to allow all of those things immediately just by passing Prop 10, which would have been a repeal of our only landlord protection here called Costa-Hawkins. The Costa-Hawkins Act was instituted in 1995 in response to strict rent control. And basically anything built before 1995 could not be under rent control. So new buildings after that were not subject to rent control in the city of Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. But it's a statewide law. And Prop 10 was trying to undo that, but by undoing that, it would have imposed the strictest rent control the country has ever seen. Well, the state said that the people made a mistake. So last year, Assembly Bill 1482 is the one that made the rounds, and it got signed into law. When I got rumblings of this thing, I'm like, are you kidding me? The people at 60% voted no on Prop 10, and the state said, you guys were wrong. So they instituted a statewide rent cap. Isn't that strict? But it sets the template.
Mm. Now, I'm curious. So that's the one that just went into effect here, January 1, you're referencing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
As far as, I think a lot of times before things are out on the horizon, people get pretty worked up about it, or they're worried about this or that. What has your experience been leading up to that, and then actually seeing the fallout and what has happened since then? Maybe it's not as great for you being in LA because you've already been dealing with pretty strict laws, but what kind of fallout have you seen since it went to became a law January 1?
Well, I'll just explain how big the snowball got. When Proposition 10 was being threatened, people were getting notices of rent increases, because if the law was going to be repealed by Proposition 10, landlords took action because they were waking up to this fact. There's a group, I hope I get their name right. It's either Better Homes for Long Beach or Better Housing for Long Beach. Joni Weir's their president. I interviewed them. It was my first interview actually for my show, because I supported their efforts. She basically dropped everything she was doing, mom and pop rental shop, and just to become an activist for landlords. And she revealed to me that a lot of brokers, a lot of real estate agents that have landlords to contact are not informing them about rent control. So a lot of people are being naive about this because they're afraid, what if I tell my client and they just end up selling their property and move out of state? I just lost my income. Well, you're not doing a service to your client. You're not informing them of what's coming down the pipeline. So when the rumblings were being felt by the landlords that this could be very real, that we could have a statewide rent cap, some of them looked at the units finally and said, holy smokes, I have depressed rental rates. If I only been raising the rent $5 a year for the past 20 years, you weren't raising them as you should have. So landlords were not managing the property. Were not taking care of the property as they should, like running it like a business. Mm-hmm. They were looking at it more as like, no, it's just passive income. But now in seeing that, in the rate of inflation, everything's gone up, and just the price of commodities and all that, it's like, well, if some of those landlords were now reaching retirement or are retirees, they realize this is my fixed income and not enough for me to live off of, because Social Security isn't paying me enough. So some of them woke up and started raising the rents. And in order for you to raise rents more, like an astronomical number, that's a 60-day notice of rent increase. That's where the news started picking up a lot of press. You'll find some of these clippings on Google if you look for them. Some people getting 60-day notices, like, my rent's doubled. Because if it's doubled, that's because the landlord wasn't paying attention to the times and wasn't raising the rent accordingly. So they're bringing it to market rate, but the tenants are not seeing that. And that's also unreasonable to expect the tenant to even pay that. And some of them are going to be forced onto the street if they've been so used to such a low rent rate, because that sets the expectation for what's out there. And then when they go out and see there aren't low prices and rents, where else can they go when they see that they're stuck? They end up going to the legislator and say, I need help. And that's where a lot of this chant came from. So last year, when the assembly was getting this bill, a lot of realtors were getting notice of this. Over here, we have multiple associations for real estate, but the state one is the California Association of Realtors. I was at odds with them. In October, I was invited to one of the member meetings, and it was a very tense meeting, because it's no disrespect to the association. I do blame them for the misinformation that basically allowed proponents of rent control to vote accidentally in favor of rent control, because CAR, as their acronym is, was involved in helping set the legislation and how this 1482 can benefit landlords at the same time protecting tenants. But all the provisions for the landlords were thrown out, and all the tenant protections were kept in. Mm-hmm. And because it happened, some of the supporters of the bill that supposedly were protecting landlords too says, "But I thought this is what you wanted," they said to CAR. So now the fallout is that, okay, we lost this battle. Now let's get something on the ballot to get it repealed. And CAR said that they're not going to fight this. Like, Why? Let's take it to the ballot box. Let's get a proposition, lobby for a proposition that the general public can vote for to overturn AB 1482. And the association said they're not going to do it. Like, well, this is ridiculous. So I walked out of that meeting and I immediately recorded a podcast because I'm like, okay, here are my predictions. This was the first week of October last year. And I said, get ready for an increase of homelessness due to mass evictions, because landlords are now going to realize that once they get wind that this bill is going to arrive to the governor's desk by mid-October, and there was no doubt he was going to sign it, they're going to have to jack up their rents because now it's for sure. And because of that, Thanksgiving and Christmas are ruined. The holidays have totally been ruined. You're going to have an increase in homelessness. And guess what? That's exactly what happened. Mass evictions. It got so bad. Los Angeles issued a moratorium that they were not going to recognize the legal evictions landlords were doing. The 60-day notices of eviction, the 90-day notices. They said, we're not honoring those. Don't worry about it. You're staying in your home. And other city councils started doing the same.
Now, did you hear, so obviously, the city of LA is thinking of it in terms of like maybe somebody's been a good tenant and the only reason they're being evicted is because they can't, pay this rent that's getting doubled. But I'm sure you've heard stories of landlords who are probably going through just a natural eviction because a tenant, stopped paying rent or was damaging the property or something like that. So that must have been really awful if you were somebody who landed in that position where you're just evicting a bad tenant and not because you're like trying to double up the rent. Did you hear any stories like that coming through? Or
Oh, absolutely. And that's the problem, that bad apples give bad names to everybody. Mm-hmm. And all landlords are lumped into this, like all landlords are bad because of idiots that weren't paying attention to the times and only look at the green and cause this ruckus. Like, so if you don't understand that your thing is a business, and that the golden principle of business is that 80% of your business comes from 20% of your customers. If you have a good tenant that's never damaged your property ever, maybe paying depressed rental rates, but they've never been a headache to you, and you want to replace them with another tenant that will supposedly pay you the market rent, and then they come in and just destroy your property, how does that benefit you?
Yeah,
because there are legit cases of evictions that this thing called no fault evictions is what was included with the rent cap, that you can't just evict for just anything. Supposedly, like, oh, tenant, guess what? I got family coming over. I'm going to need the unit, so you're out. Technically, that's not good enough. And honestly, I don't like that either. But it's the tenant's not the owner, so they should know that too. But it just made things bad all around. And because the news of rent control was happening around the summer, a lot of landlords that were capable were raising the rent between then and the end of the year. And then the bill got signed to like, okay, I only have 2 months to get something in place to get market rent. So then once the new year kicks in, January 1st rolls around, I have rent at the market rate, and then it's capped at that point. So I'll be okay. But in certain places, you couldn't evict anymore. So they were stuck with that. And because the state knew that was going to happen, that's where they introduced rollback rent. So as of January 1st, the law kicks in, but the rent cap is in effect all the way to March 15th of 2019. So if you raise that rent in those 9 months, you go all the way back, take it to the original number you had on March 14th, and then adjust at the 8% from there.
Oh. I didn't know that. I did not hear that.
Well, yeah, that's rollback rent. Yeah, there is. Santa Monica here in California also has rent control. So Santa Monica, San Francisco, and Los Angeles are some of the oldest rent control you'll find here. One of the things that I think Santa Monica still has it, which is why this rent cap isn't enough for tenant activists. There's something called vacancy decontrol. Are you familiar with this?
No.
Okay, vacancy decontrol is this. If you have a unit that is basically depressed in terms of its rental rate, if the tenant leaves or the tenant is evicted for whatever reason, whether there's repairs onto the unit or not, the landlord can then start a new lease agreement at the rental rate, as it should be, the market rent, not the previous one. Mm-hmm. Well, that vacancy decontrol is trying to be removed, because that's to say that the rate of the previous tenant will carry over to the new one, unless you've done extensive renovations to the unit to justify the increase. So some rent control places do have that instituted, LA being one of them, but you would think that the rent cap would be good news for everybody. No, because last month the tenant activists were able to get the signatures for what it looks like is going to be called the Rental Affordability Act, that the state controller will, or the auditor, I forget what they're called, they're going to analyze in June to then approve and assign a proposition number to it so then the public could vote on it. It's like, okay, you got the statewide rent cap. What is this Rental Affordability Act that you're talking about? And people don't know yet. But for anybody that has an idea, the first thing I could tell you is that that must be the repeal of Costa-Hawkins. Why would you ask for a Rental Affordability Act after the statewide rent cap is in place? Because it's not good enough for people. The statewide rent cap basically weakens Costa-Hawkins to say that Costa-Hawkins, the statewide law says there's no rent control for buildings built after 1995. But there's a lot of new buildings that have been put up since then. So it's like, how do we get rent control there? Well, let's soften it up and move the goalpost. Now it's the year 2005. So as of this year, the buildings that are 15 years old do not get rent control. But it's a moving goalpost, because in 2021, now the properties that are 2005 now fall under the rent control. So they keep moving the goalpost. So they want to eliminate it altogether to say that any old and new buildings will be under rent control. And some local cities are trying to institute their own version of the ordinance because they become stricter. They use the state as a basis, and they just ride above that. And LA being a great example of the strictest you can get, along with San Francisco. And I think it should be no surprise that the homelessness epidemic that people hear about are in Los Angeles and San Francisco. San Francisco being among the worst. You have an average of 25 to 28,000 pieces of human excrement being picked up on a monthly basis. They have a literal poop patrol up there, just assigned to picking up poop off the streets. And in Los Angeles, this was I believe LA was ground zero for the hepatitis breakout from the homelessness camps that spread all the way to San Diego, not vice versa. And for I'm outside Anaheim. Anaheim is home to the Angels that are known as the Los Angeles Angels of Anaheim, because LA can't keep their hands off Orange County. So when you would drive on the freeway, you could see what is called the Big A in the baseball stadium. For a long time last year, you couldn't see that anymore because it was all blocked because there's a riverbed that runs by it. You would just see a homelessness camp all across that, just blocking the view of the stadium. And the new mayor had to deal with that. There was like 3 tons of waste that was removed from there after the ones that were relocated. They were relocated to temporary housing. And there was just a huge debate as to where they should ultimately go because the shelters were full. So we do have a homelessness epidemic here as well. So it's like there's no one easy solution to rent control. But what I can say, to the housing affordability crisis, but what I can say, rent control is not the one that will solve it. It's the one that's made it worse. And where San Francisco goes, California goes. And when you have the governor that was the same guy that ruined San Francisco in the first place, he's going to ruin and continue ruining California. And we are supposedly the example for the rest of the country. So where California goes, the rest of the country might go. You have some presidential candidates right now talking about a federal rent control. Like, excuse me? It's like, so now it's taken to the federal level. And if some of these get their way, you might end up seeing that. So regardless of what happened in New York, because I don't know if it was New York State or New York City that instituted the rent cap last year. Was that the West City or was it the state?
The statewide, yeah.
Okay, and when you see the articles that were put up, this is one article from progressive websites. It says, "Oh, landlords are crying about the statewide rent cap. Put their tears into an IV and hook it up to my arm." Because they wanted to live off the landlord's grief. That's the problem. that there really isn't a conversation about all this. It's only going in one direction, and landlords are asleep at the wheel on this. And when some of them wake up to this, they're doing more damage than good when they're not managing their properties right. That's why I recommend it to people, and I guess this is a plug-in for RentPrep. I exclusively use RentPrep for screening out tenants, and so far it's worked out very well for us. It's been 2 years now since I've been using the service, and that is not enough though to do a tenant screening. What I learned from my parents was get to know these people. Like, there's always so much you can do, but treat it as a job interview. You're inviting people to take care of your property.
Mm-hmm.
This is a relationship. You're going to entrust the care of your property to these people. Don't just see that ka-ching, here comes money. Say, no, you want people that can take care of it. And it's some of the reports that we've gotten back verified that some of these people that we've looked at, they have just horrible credit. And most people that have come to apply for a lease will tell me that look, my credit's bad. I tell you have an equal shot as someone that has excellent credit. So go ahead. And guess what? The tenants that we've signed into the lease years ago that have awful credit have not once failed to pay us the rent, including rent increases.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not to judge someone just because they have bad credit. It's not to judge somebody like, oh, the way they look. We have to treat this as a job interview. And I think that's what people that try to own property and run them don't understand.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're not careful, we're going to see something like here in California happen throughout the rest of the country, where every single tool that's available for a landlord to own, manage, and protect their property is basically being removed. You can't evict them. You can't raise the rent on them. And that's why we have an exodus of landlords.
Mm-hmm.
This is the census year. I'm really curious to see this because the last census was the first time in history, and let me get my notes here, I don't want to be misquoted, that 2010 California failed to gain a new seat in the House of Representatives, even though we have supposedly an increase in population. But we have a migration issue where people are leaving. They're leaving for other states. Mm-hmm. They're leaving for lower taxes, better way of living, or better cost of living. But what did they take with them? The housing affordability crisis, because now those places are being hurt. Texas isn't welcoming the Calis. They're not happy about that. Sections in Idaho, they're not happy about that. There were these senior citizens that got together in the heartland that went to the legislature to ask for rent control because the rents were going up. And then when you see what's going on, what's causing those things to go up is because people that are leaving from here are landing out there. It's like, oh, it's cheaper for me to go out there. $38,000 can buy me a house in Tennessee. Yeah, I'm going to go over there. So like over here, $38,000, that's your rent a year. Mm-hmm. So that's what's happening. And based on, this is from the hill.com, they're talking about that it's estimated that California as of 2019 will actually lose a seat in the House of Representatives. That is our migration issue. There are some companies that are as big as mine, like 40 or 50 units. They've already left. So mm-hmm. It's like, there's nothing for me here. I'm leaving. And for those like, well, let's just go after those greedy commercial companies. Well, yeah, you could try to hurt their bottom line, but guess what? They have the ability to liquidate their assets and just move. And because of diversified product, you're not going to hurt them. Mm-hmm. They're either gone or already have some fail safes in place. And that's what's sad, because the ones that are caught in the crossfire are the landlords. There was a battle here in Anaheim for rent control before the rent control, the statewide rent control cap. Last summer, there was this case called Casa Grande, and the residents there, there's about 20 units. They went to the city council. They were begging for the city to get involved in this, and the city did, because it was a new property owner, and they tried to jack up their rents. It was literally double, mm-hmm. But doubling up was still less than the market rent. It's like $200 to $300 less than the market rent. And there was a big heated battle. Some council members were just throwing racial slurs in the council against other people of color too. It's like, what is going on? Just because they don't believe that rent control will work in favor of Anaheim. But anyway, it was a very contentious issue. The council, the majority voted to not institute rent control. But the mayor brought the new property owner and the citizens together the residents together to have a conversation. I hope I'm not commingling these two issues, because there were two issues. One of them is Casa Grande, the biggest one. There was another one about mobile homes, and he was able to broker some kind of a agreement between them. But in the case of Casa,
him bringing them together, he was actually able to mediate and kind of find some common ground and actually work through it.
Yes. So that was in the case of the mobile homes. And in the case of the Casa Grande units, what ended up happening was that the tenants realizing that, hey, I don't have to stay here and pay this rent. A lot of them, when they went to go shop around and saw just the reality of what rental prices were, 19 out of the 20 signed on the lease, with one being the holdout. One of them being the holdout is actually one of the ones that have been pushing for the Rental Housing Affordability Act that looks to be legitimized for the ballot box. And on top of that, if this has not reached word to New York, it should have. There's this group called Moms for Housing. This happened in Oakland, California, back in November. It was two families, two single moms with kids, and there was a house that was vacant, and they broke into the house. Well, let me rephrase. The door was unlocked, so they basically entered the house and squatted. They kept the house, and because they basically became a symbol for the resistance, the community at large was their supporters, and they actually had people that worked as security guards volunteering to protect them from the property, from the landlord and any officials coming over to try to evict them.
What?
This was back in November. They were finally evicted in January. This was Alameda County. The sheriff's department had arrived there in force. A lot of people were present, and the people were evicted. But their story, their plight, resonated with the community, which was helping to continue to push for more housing affordability, and basically encouraging that if you do see an empty unit, to the housing affordability crisis being an epidemic or a pandemic at this point, that just go squat in there, because we need to send a note to the landlords that they cannot gouge us anymore. So that's been the encouragement through there. I'm not judging anybody here. I'm just simply saying that breaking the law is not something that I would encourage anybody to do.
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's I feel like we're already like a half hour in, and you could probably talk about this for 4 more hours as far as the different angles and different ways you can look at it. And I think that's why people do spend a lot of time talking about this, because it's so pivotal to people's lives, whether you're a landlord or, in your case, a property manager, you're an investor, or you're a tenant. And it's so important and crucial, because it's whether it's, how you're making your retirement income or how you're living your life as it is. So it's a really tough conversation to kind of navigate and figure out. But I feel like we'll have more information on it too as the months start rolling by, and you kind of see what the rollout effects of this is long term too, I'd imagine.
Oh. Well, absolutely, because you're just going to see an increase in homelessness, no doubt.
Yeah,
it's going to happen, because the only way to avoid rent control is to basically have a new property. Then your solution, if you have the means and ability to do so, is to remove the tenants, demolish the building, and build a new. And you might find that it's cheaper to do that and start renting at the market rate from there with the statewide rent cap that will eventually be in place. Like, holy smokes. The only solution that is viable is to build actual housing that can affect the prices of homes. You have a high demand for people to be able to buy, then you need to have houses that people can buy. And when you're, like I said, you're turning over 50 to 100-year-old properties, then who's buying? I mean, who can buy?
Yeah.
And there's another mindset where high earners are not buying because they prefer to live in dense population areas and just use mass transit. They don't believe in buying because they think they'll be greedy or whatever. The majority of people still believe buying a home is the American dream. And I say go for it. So the legislator needs to free up some land to actually build and reduce EPA regulations to bring the cost of construction down. And that's the only way we'll be able to see a dent into this housing affordability crisis, because you do see a bunch of high-rises going everywhere. But all these are luxury apartments.
Yeah.
And if there wasn't a demand for those, they wouldn't be building them. That's why Gavin Newsom is trying to sue cities and say some of those have to be low-income units. You can't make this stuff up.
Yeah.
It's California for you.
Well, on your podcast, you want to tell people about that? Because I'm sure you've had content on this if people want to consume more on this topic.
Oh, absolutely. Anybody can check out my podcast is available across every major distributor that you can think of. The Andres Segovia Show, you can look that up. If you type just Andres Segovia, you're going to get the world famous guitarist. So you have to type in the Andres Segovia and you'll get me. You can find me on Google too. I'm on YouTube as well, where I do more tech related videos, because that's more like, let me show you instead of talking about it. But every now and then I do address things with some graphics about what's going on in real estate. But that's the place where I talk about real estate, I talk about tech, and I talk about life coaching. It's for everybody alike, from tenants to landlords to property managers, anyone in between. But yeah, they can definitely check my stuff out there. I do just basic real estate stuff. Lately, I have been having to cover this real estate stuff. So my last episode was about the housing affordability crisis. I recorded 4.5 hours of material, only used 50 minutes of it. So it's just so much to talk about, and you just can't condense it. And I'm just hoping that both sides are able to come to the table, because that's the only way to make it happen.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Andres. I appreciate the insights. I'm sure our audience does as well.
Yeah. Thank you for having me on, Eric.